The declaration was supposed to be routine. Another expansion notice, another minor system claimed by a rising power eager to prove itself in a galaxy that measured worth in territory taken and resistance crushed. The chamber lights dimmed automatically as the announcement protocol engaged, casting the vast assembly in a calculated twilight that always made these moments feel inevitable, almost ceremonial. Hundreds of species turned their attention to the central dais, some out of interest, most out of habit. "We will be securing the Sol system," the War Minister announced, his voice amplified across 1,000 translation bands. "The third planet, designated Earth, will be absorbed into our dominion within one standard cycle." There should have been applause. There should have been the low murmur of approval that followed every confident claim, the subtle recalculations of alliances, the quiet admiration reserved for a power bold enough to expand in public view. Instead, something far stranger happened. Silence spread, not the polite, expectant silence of diplomacy, but something heavier, something that moved through the chamber like a pressure drop before a storm. It started with the oldest delegates. One of them, a being whose species had outlived entire civilizations, slowly lowered its gaze as if refusing to witness what had just been set in motion. Another deactivated its translation field entirely, as though language itself had become unnecessary. Across the chamber, several senior observers did something even more unsettling. They began transmitting encrypted signals away from the Council in urgent bursts, ignoring protocol. The War Minister noticed, but he smiled anyway. "Is there an objection?" he asked, his tone edged with amusement. "Surely none of you claim interest in such a primitive world." No one answered. A junior archivist stationed along the upper ring frowned at her console, her attention caught not by the declaration, but by the system map that had automatically expanded in response. Earth's star system rotated slowly in holographic projection, unremarkable by every visible metric. Standard orbital patterns. Moderate industrial output. Fragmented planetary governance. Nothing that justified the reaction she was seeing. And yet, layered beneath the public data, something flickered. Restricted markers. She leaned closer, overriding her own clearance limits in a quiet act of curiosity she would later regret. The system pulsed once, then revealed a buried designation that had not been accessed in centuries. Contact status. Observational only engagement protocol. Prohibited proximity limit. Enforced. Her breath caught. Those markers were not used for primitive worlds. They were not even used for hostile ones. They were reserved for something else entirely, cases where intervention itself was considered a risk. Behind her, the chamber shifted again. 2 entire delegations stood up at once and left without requesting adjournment. A third began issuing evacuation advisories across its private network, bypassing council authority altogether. No one tried to stop them. The War Minister's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. "You are overreacting," he said, more sharply now. "Our intelligence confirms the target's limitations. They possess no unified space defense, no coherent command structure, no." "Then why," a voice interrupted quietly from the far end of the chamber, "has no one touched them?" The question did not echo. It didn't need to. It landed with a weight that made even the automated systems hesitate, as if the chamber itself was recalculating something it did not understand. The War Minister turned toward the speaker, irritation flashing across his expression. "Because they are irrelevant." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't disbelief. It was recognition. The archivist looked back at her console, her pulse quickening as more hidden data began surfacing in response to the growing network activity around her. Old records. Sealed reports. Fragments of something deliberately buried. One line appeared, then locked itself in place before she could scroll further. "They are not irrelevant." She didn't know who had written it. There was no author tag, no timestamp, no context, just a statement embedded deep enough that it had survived every purge and reclassification that followed. Across the chamber, the War Minister straightened, regaining his composure as the silence stretched too long for comfort. "Our fleets are already in motion," he said, his voice now carrying a harder edge. "By the time this assembly decides how it feels, the matter will be concluded." This time, there was a response. Not spoken. The chamber's central display shifted without authorization. Not to the Sol system. To a wide-field projection of surrounding sectors. One by one, distant systems began dimming as evacuation protocols activated. Trade routes rerouted. Civilian traffic redirected. Military assets repositioned, not toward Earth, but away from it. The archivist stared at the unfolding pattern, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing. They weren't preparing to defend the target. They were preparing to survive it. And somewhere, far beyond the chamber, beyond the reach of official channels and controlled narratives, something had already begun to move in response to a message that had not yet been fully understood. The War Minister followed the display, confusion replacing confidence for the first time. "What exactly," he demanded, "do you think is going to happen?" No one answered. But the archivist couldn't stop staring at that single line buried in the data, the one that felt less like a warning and more like a memory the galaxy had tried, and failed, to forget. They are not irrelevant. And whatever that meant, it was already too late to ask. By the time the fleet crossed the outer boundary of the Sol system, the War Minister had convinced himself the Council's reaction had been nothing more than political theater. Ancient powers were prone to superstition, he reminded his command staff, especially when faced with a younger force rising too quickly for their comfort. Fear, in his experience, was often just a disguise for envy. The system ahead of them did little to challenge that belief. Long-range scans returned exactly what the intelligence brief had promised. A yellow main sequence star. 9 major planetary bodies. Standard asteroid distribution. Moderate orbital infrastructure clustered around the third planet. There were satellites, yes, but most of them appeared dedicated to communication, navigation, and environmental monitoring. No heavy defense platforms. No visible shipyards capable of producing war fleets. No organized patrol formations. It looked ordinary. "Confirm again," the War Minister said, though there was already satisfaction creeping into his voice. "No standing fleet." "None detected," his sensor officer replied. "There are scattered vessels, but they are civilian in classification, cargo haulers, passenger transports, maintenance craft. No coordinated military presence." A low ripple of approval moved across the bridge. This was exactly the kind of target that built reputations. Quick, decisive, undeniable. A demonstration to the galaxy that dominance did not require drawn-out wars, only clarity of will. "Open a channel," he ordered. "Let them understand the situation before we waste time." The transmission reached Earth almost instantly, carried across the system by networks that, while primitive by galactic standards, were efficient enough for their scale. For several seconds, there was only static and fragmented signal noise, as if the planet itself were struggling to decide how to respond. Then a voice came through. It wasn't polished. It wasn't authoritative in the way the War Minister expected. It sounded human. Slightly uneven, layered with background interference, like it had passed through too many systems before reaching them. "Unidentified vessels," the voice said, careful and measured. "You are approaching a restricted orbital zone. Please state your intentions." The War Minister almost laughed. "Restricted," he repeated, muting the channel. "They have no concept of scale." Around him, his officers relaxed further, the last traces of tension dissolving into quiet confidence. "Respond," he said. "Make it simple." The channel reopened. "This system is now under our authority," he announced. "You will stand down all operations and prepare for integration. Compliance will ensure minimal disruption." There was a pause. Longer this time. Not confusion. Not panic. Something else. "We need time," the voice replied. The War Minister's expression hardened slightly. "Time is not part of this exchange." "We need time," the voice repeated, more clearly now, "to inform our governments." A flicker of amusement returned. "Governments. Plural. How many separate authorities control this planet?" he asked his intelligence officer. "Estimates suggest over 200 recognized entities, with additional substructures," came the reply. The War Minister shook his head slowly, almost incredulous. "Fragmented beyond efficiency. They cannot even speak as one." He leaned forward slightly, his tone sharpening. "You have 1 standard hour," he said into the channel. "After that, we will begin corrective action." The transmission cut. For a moment, the bridge was filled with quiet satisfaction. A single hour. It was more than generous, more than necessary. Enough time for panic to spread, for resistance to collapse before it even formed. But as the seconds passed, something began to shift. "Sir," the communications officer said, frowning at her display, "we are detecting unusual signal activity." "Clarify." "Planet-wide transmissions," she replied. "Not centralized. They are broadcasting across multiple frequencies simultaneously. Civilian networks, industrial relays, even outdated analog bands." "Translation?" he asked. "They are talking to each other," she said slowly. "All of them." The War Minister dismissed it with a wave. "Disorganized response. Expected." But the signals didn't behave like panic. They weren't chaotic. They weren't overlapping in the way uncoordinated systems usually did under stress. There was structure there, layered, repeating, building. Patterns that shifted and adapted as new data flowed through them. "Sir," another officer added, "the transmissions are not limited to the planet. We're seeing activity in the asteroid belt, outer system relays, even deep space probes." "That's impossible," the War Minister snapped. "Those assets should not be linked in real time." "They weren't," the officer replied quietly. "Until now." Across the bridge, the ambient confidence began to thin, replaced by something less defined. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty, sharp and unwelcome. "Continue monitoring," the War Minister ordered. "They are improvising under pressure. It will not hold." But even as he said it, the system display shifted again. New contacts appeared, not ships, not signatures in the traditional sense, but energy fluctuations across previously inactive zones. Mining stations adjusting output. Cargo routes rerouting mid-transit. Orbital platforms altering position with a precision that suggested prior alignment, not spontaneous reaction. It was as if the entire system had begun to rearrange itself. "Explain," he demanded. No one answered immediately, because there was no doctrine for what they were seeing. On the far edge of the system, one of the outer monitoring buoys, previously flagged as defunct, came online without warning. Its signal spiked, then synchronized with the planetary network in a single, seamless transition. A moment later, dozens more followed. "Sir," the sensor officer said, his voice lower now, "these assets, they were dormant. Some for years. And now, they are not dormant anymore." The War Minister stared at the display, irritation giving way to something colder. "They had no fleet," he said slowly. "No defense grid." "No visible one," the officer corrected. The distinction hung in the air. The hour he had given them was still counting down. 47 minutes remaining. On the surface, Earth looked unchanged. Cities still burned with the soft glow of civilian life. Satellites still traced predictable paths. Nothing about the planet suggested urgency, let alone preparation for war. And yet, everything around it was waking up. Not chaotically, not desperately, but with a precision that implied something far more dangerous than fear. "Sir," the communications officer said again, her voice tight now, "they are transmitting something else." "What now?" "It's not a message," she said. "It's a pattern." The War Minister narrowed his eyes. "A pattern for what?" She hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. "But it's spreading. Across every channel. Every relay. Every dormant system that had just come alive." 42 minutes remaining. And for the first time since entering the system, the War Minister began to wonder, not whether the planet would surrender, but what exactly it had just asked time to do. The first strike was never meant to be decisive. It was meant to be educational. A demonstration, clean and controlled, designed to collapse resistance before it could take shape. The War Minister had ordered it with the same confidence he had used in dozens of prior campaigns. Apply pressure, show overwhelming superiority, and let the target understand its place in the hierarchy of the galaxy. Select a low-value target, he instructed. Remote. Minimal population. Enough to make the point without unnecessary waste. Coordinates were chosen within seconds. A small island chain on the far side of Earth's largest ocean. Sparse infrastructure. No significant military presence. Perfect. Fire. The energy discharge cut through the void in a tight, focused stream, its trajectory calculated with precision that allowed no deviation. On the bridge, officers watched with detached interest as the beam entered the planet's atmosphere, its path glowing briefly as friction ignited the surrounding air. It should have ended there. A flash. A crater. A message delivered. Instead, the ocean lit up. Not with destruction, but with response. From the surface below, something surged upward, not as a single countermeasure, but as a layered interception that unfolded in less than a heartbeat. Energy signatures flared from beneath the water, not scattered or reactive, but synchronized, as if they had been waiting for that exact vector of attack. The incoming strike fractured mid-descent, split, then vanished. What? The word didn't finish. Across the bridge, every display shifted at once as new data flooded in, overwhelming the predictive models that had governed their expectations until that moment. The targeted location was no longer just an island chain. It was something else entirely. Structures rising from beneath the ocean surface, geometric and deliberate, shedding layers of concealment as if responding to a long-anticipated trigger. That location was not flagged as military, the sensor officer said, his voice tight. There were no signatures, no emissions, nothing to indicate. Scan again, the War Minister snapped. We are scanning, the officer replied. It's not hiding anymore. The ocean platform continued to emerge, its surface breaking through the waves in expanding rings as additional components unfolded around it. What had appeared to be empty water moments ago was now a dense lattice of interconnected systems, weapon arrays, shield emitters, sensor clusters, all activating in precise sequence. It wasn't improvised. It wasn't newly deployed. It had been there the entire time. Waiting. Is this an isolated installation? The War Minister demanded. The answer came too quickly. No, sir. The system map expanded outward. Across Earth's orbit, across its moons, across the asteroid belt and beyond, similar signatures began to appear. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic reveal, but in a cascade that felt almost deliberate in its pacing. One activation triggered another, each node connecting to the same growing network, each system aligning itself with something larger. Hidden shipyards tucked inside mineral extraction facilities. Defense arrays embedded within civilian orbital stations. Energy grids repurposing themselves into targeting matrices. What we are detecting, the sensor officer continued, struggling to keep up with the data, is not a defense system in the conventional sense. Then what is it? The War Minister pressed. The officer hesitated. It's everything. The words landed harder than any alarm. Because they weren't describing a fleet. They were describing a structure. A system-wide architecture that had been built piece by piece, concealed within the normal function of an entire civilization. Nothing about it violated the appearance of a developing world, until it all activated at once. They have no centralized command signature, another officer added. No single point of coordination. And yet they are coordinating, the War Minister said, his voice lower now. Yes, sir. How? No one had an answer. Because the pattern they were seeing didn't follow known military logic. It wasn't hierarchical. It wasn't even fully predictable. Each node responded to local conditions, adapting in real time, feeding information back into the network in a way that made the whole system smarter with every second. Decentralized. Adaptive. Alive. Sir, the communications officer said, her attention fixed on a separate feed. The transmission pattern has changed. Explain. It's no longer just internal, she said. They are broadcasting outward. Broadcasting what? Coordinates, she replied. Signals. Routing data. To who? He asked. She shook her head slightly. Not to a specific recipient. It's open. The War Minister felt something tighten in his chest. Open to what? Before she could answer, the first new contact appeared. At the edge of the asteroid belt, a faint signature flickered into existence, not emerging from hyperspace, not arriving from outside the system, but revealing itself. A vessel that had been present, unnoticed, now stepping into visibility as its concealment dropped. Then another. And another. Not military designs in the traditional sense. Some were clearly modified cargo ships. Others bore the irregular outlines of civilian transports. A few were so asymmetrical they defied classification entirely. "What are those?" one officer whispered. "They were always here," the sensor officer said. More signals appeared. Hundreds. Then thousands. Not forming ranks. Not aligning into formations. But moving. Each on its own vector, its own trajectory, yet somehow converging toward the same expanding engagement zone. "This is not a fleet," the War Minister said quietly. "No, sir," the officer replied. "It's not supposed to be." The system display continued to fill, red markers blooming across the tactical grid as every newly revealed ship was flagged as a potential threat. But the density alone wasn't the problem. It was the unpredictability. "They are not following standard engagement protocols," the tactical officer said. "No formation discipline. No command synchronization." "Then how are they operating?" the War Minister demanded. The answer came from a place he hadn't expected. "They're not operating like a military," the communications officer said softly. The bridge fell silent. "Then what are they?" he asked. She didn't look away from her screen. "They're all of them," she said. "Every signal source we're tracking. It's not just designated combat vessels. It's private ships, commercial routes, independent operators." The realization spread across the bridge in slow, cold waves. "This is not a defensive deployment," she continued. "This is a response." "To what?" the War Minister asked. But even as he said it, he already knew. Not to the strike. Not to the ultimatum. To the message. The one they had asked time to send. Across the system, more ships emerged from concealment, their numbers growing beyond any initial projection. They came from orbital lanes, from hidden docks, from the shadowed sides of moons and the depths of asteroid fields. No uniform. No single design philosophy. No central command. And yet, they were moving with purpose. "Sir," the sensor officer said again, his voice tight with something that was no longer just uncertainty. "We are being surrounded." The War Minister stared at the expanding field of contacts, his earlier confidence unraveling into something sharper, more dangerous. "How many?" he asked. The officer swallowed. "We don't know," he admitted. "They're still appearing." Across every screen, the same impossible truth was taking shape. There had never been a fleet to detect, because the fleet had never been separate from the world it was defending. And now it was all awake. The first instinct of the War Minister was to impose order. Not retreat. Not hesitation. Order. "All units, consolidate into primary formation," he commanded, his voice cutting cleanly through the rising noise on the bridge. "We will force them into a standard engagement. They cannot sustain this level of disorganization." The fleet responded instantly. Hundreds of warships shifted into structured alignment, their positions locking into precise geometric spacing designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire and shield efficiency. It was a formation perfected over centuries, predictable only to those who did not understand its complexity. On the display, it looked like control. In reality, it was the first mistake, because the humans did not respond to structure with structure. They broke it. The incoming vessels, if they could even be called that, did not slow, did not realign, did not acknowledge the formation as something to counter. They scattered instead, each altering trajectory at the last possible moment, weaving through the edges of engagement range like fragments of something that refused to hold shape. "Maintain targeting lock," the tactical officer said quickly. "They will have to commit eventually." But they didn't. They slipped between the predictive models, not faster than expected, not stronger than expected, but different. Each movement invalidated the next calculation, forcing the targeting systems to constantly adjust, constantly recalculate, never quite settling on a stable solution. "Fire at will," the War Minister ordered. The fleet unleashed its first full volley. Energy surged across the void in controlled bursts, beams intersecting in layered patterns designed to trap and overwhelm any incoming force. It was a display of precision warfare, every shot calculated, every angle optimized. It should have worked. Instead, it passed through empty space. Not because the targets had moved beyond range, but because they had never been where the models said they would be. They are not committing to vectors, the tactical officer said, her voice sharpening. Their movement is random. The war minister cut in. No, she replied. It only looks random. That distinction mattered, because randomness could be predicted with enough data. This could not. Across the engagement zone, the human vessels continued to maneuver independently, each following its own logic, its own decision-making process. No central command signals. No synchronized turns. No shared timing markers. And yet, they weren't colliding. They weren't interfering with each other. They were cooperating. Explain their coordination, the war minister demanded. We can't detect it, the communications officer replied. There is no centralized channel, no encrypted command stream. If they are communicating, it is happening outside our detection parameters. Then how are they? The question died as the first impact registered. A warship on the outer edge of the formation shuddered violently, its shields flaring as something struck it. Not an energy beam, not a missile, but a kinetic impact that the defensive systems had not prioritized. What hit us? The war minister snapped. Physical projectile, came the reply. High-velocity mass. Minimal energy signature. That should not penetrate. It didn't, the officer said quickly. But it disrupted the shield harmonics. A second impact followed. Then a third. Not from a single direction, but from multiple angles, each strike timed just far enough apart to prevent full recalibration. The ship's defenses, designed to adapt to consistent threats, were being forced into constant adjustment, never stabilizing long enough to function at peak efficiency. They're probing, the tactical officer said. No, the communications officer corrected, her voice tight. They're learning. Across the formation, more impacts began to register. Small at first. Individually insignificant. But together, they created a pattern, a stress applied not to destroy, but to destabilize. Return fire, the war minister ordered. Eliminate those vectors. But there were no clear vectors. Each attacking vessel changed position after every strike, never repeating the same approach, never allowing the targeting systems to build a reliable profile. Some came in low, skimming along the system plane. Others dropped from above or rose from beneath, using three-dimensional space in ways that ignored traditional engagement doctrine. They have no formation discipline, one officer said, almost accusingly. Then why are they not interfering with each other? Another shot back. No one answered. Because the truth was becoming harder to ignore. They didn't need discipline. They needed intent. Sir, the sensor officer said suddenly, we are detecting new activity within the debris field. What debris field? The war minister asked. The one we just created, the officer replied. Fragments from destroyed vessels, both human and otherwise, were drifting through the engagement zone. Twisted metal. Broken components. Scattered material. Except now, some of those fragments were moving. Clarify, the war minister said, his voice tightening. They are not inert, the officer continued. Some of the debris contains active propulsion signatures. They are using wreckage, the tactical officer realized. Not as cover. As weapons. Small fragments accelerated unpredictably, their paths intersecting with fleet positions in ways that made them difficult to track and nearly impossible to classify as threats until impact was imminent. Some detonated on contact. Others simply struck and continued, carrying damage deeper into the formation. This is inefficient, the war minister said, more to himself than anyone else. It is wasteful. They are not optimizing for efficiency, the communications officer said quietly. The war minister turned toward her, something cold settling behind his eyes. Then what are they optimizing for? She hesitated, then answered. Effect. The word hung in the air as another ship reported failure, its systems disrupted not by overwhelming force, but by cumulative damage applied in ways that bypassed conventional defense logic. They are attacking assumptions, the tactical officer said. The war minister said nothing, because he could see it now. Every response they made, every adjustment, every attempt to impose structure was being anticipated, not in detail but in principle. The humans were not countering specific actions. They were countering expectations. Sir, the communications officer said again, her voice quieter now. There's something else. What now? They're transmitting again. The War Minister clenched his jaw. On what channel? All of them. Content. She hesitated longer this time, then brought the audio feed online. At first, it sounded like noise. Layered signals overlapping in chaotic patterns, fragments of voices cutting through static, bursts of sound that didn't match any known communication protocol. Then the translator began to stabilize, and the noise resolved into something else entirely. Not commands. Not coordination. Voices. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Different tones, different accents, different languages, some shouting, some laughing, some speaking calmly as if this were routine. Are these military channels? One officer asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. No, the communications officer said. Then what are we hearing? She didn't look away from the feed. Everyone. The realization spread slowly, like a fracture moving through glass. This is not a controlled engagement, the War Minister said quietly. No, sir, she replied. It never was. On the display, the human vessels continued to move, not as a fleet, not as a unit, but as something far more difficult to define. Every ship an individual. Every individual part of the whole. No single point of failure. No single command to break. Just a system that adapted faster than it could be understood. Sir, the sensor officer said, his voice tight with something that was no longer just concern. We are losing outer formation integrity. The War Minister didn't respond immediately, because for the first time since entering the system, he wasn't thinking about how to win. He was trying to understand what he was fighting, and the more he watched, the less it resembled anything the galaxy had ever classified as war. Somewhere, deep in the back of his mind, a thought began to form, unwelcome, unproven, but impossible to ignore. This wasn't chaos. It was something worse. It was a species that had never needed permission to fight this way, and had been waiting for someone foolish enough to make them. The War Minister did not order a retreat. He ordered escalation. All reserve divisions forward, he said, his voice colder now, stripped of the earlier confidence and sharpened into something more deliberate. Break their perimeter. Force them into collapse. Across the fleet, heavier warships began advancing from the rear, vessels built not for demonstration, but for annihilation. Their weapon systems powered up in unison, energy levels rising high enough to distort the surrounding void, their targeting arrays sweeping wide arcs across the engagement zone. If the earlier phase had been a test, this was meant to be the correction. And yet, the moment the formation shifted, the humans changed with it. Not in response to the movement. In anticipation of it. Sir, the tactical officer said, her voice tightening. They are already repositioning. How? The War Minister demanded. We have not transmitted. They didn't need us to, she replied. On the display, the scattered human vessels began to drift, not retreating, not advancing, but adjusting in ways that seemed almost casual at first glance. But the patterns, when viewed as a whole, formed something unmistakable. They were opening corridors. Not for escape. For movement. For what? One officer whispered. No one answered. Because the answer arrived on its own. From the outer edges of the system, far beyond the initial engagement zone, new signals began to rise. Not the irregular signatures of modified civilian craft. Not the scattered chaos that had defined the first wave. These were different. Massive. Stable. Deliberate. Unknown contacts, the sensor officer said, his voice dropping. Multiple vectors. High-mass readings. We are unable to classify. Project them, the War Minister snapped. The display shifted. What appeared were not ships in the conventional sense. They were structures in motion. Long angular silhouettes emerging from behind the gas giant's shadow, their surfaces reflecting almost no energy signature, as if they had been designed to exist just outside the range of standard detection. They moved slowly, but with a weight that suggested something far beyond the improvisation they had been facing. These are military vessels, the tactical officer said, her earlier uncertainty gone. Purpose-built. How many? The War Minister asked. The sensor officer hesitated. "More than we expected," he said carefully. "Less than we can confirm." The ambiguity did nothing to steady the room. Because for the first time since the battle began, the humans were not adapting. They were revealing. "All units, target the incoming vessels," the War Minister ordered. "We end this before they can deploy." The fleet responded instantly, redirecting firepower toward the new arrivals. Energy surged again, beams cutting across space with devastating intent. But the human vessels did not react. They did not accelerate. They did not evade. They simply absorbed. A field shimmered briefly around the lead structure, not a traditional shield, but something denser, layered, diffusing the incoming energy across its surface before dissipating it entirely. "Impact minimal," the sensor officer reported. "Impossible," the War Minister said. "Confirmed." The distance between the fleets continued to close. And then, without warning, the transmission returned. Not fragmented this time. Not distorted. Clear. Stable. "This is Earth," the voice said. The bridge fell silent. Not because of the words. Because of the tone. There was no urgency in it. No panic. No strain. Only control. "You were given time," the voice continued. "We used it." The War Minister stepped forward, his posture rigid. "You have demonstrated capability," he said, forcing authority back into his voice. "Stand down now, and your losses will be limited." There was a pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. "You still think this is about loss?" the voice replied. The War Minister's expression hardened. "It is always about loss." "No," the voice said quietly. "For you, maybe." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. "Then enlighten me." Another pause. Longer this time. And when the voice returned, it carried something new. "Wait. We learned something a long time ago," it said. "About how the galaxy works." On the main display, new data began to overlay the battlefield. Old records, partially decrypted, fragments of something buried deep within restricted archives. Not transmitted by the Council. By Earth. "You categorize strength by what you can see," the voice continued. "Fleets. Weapons. Territory." Images flickered, ancient conflicts, fragments of destroyed ships, scattered across space like broken memories. "We learned differently." The War Minister felt something shift in his chest, something he couldn't name. "You see disorder," the voice said. "Fragmentation. Inefficiency." The display shifted again. "Cities. Networks. Infrastructure. You assume its weakness." Another shift. The same systems, but viewed differently. Connected. Layered. Aligned. "It isn't." The War Minister's jaw tightened. "Then what is it?" The answer came without hesitation. "Preparation." The words settled over the bridge like a physical weight. "We knew someone would come," the voice continued. "Maybe not you, but someone." The data continued to unfold, patterns hidden within patterns, redundancies built into systems that appeared unrelated, coordination protocols embedded in civilian infrastructure so deeply they had become invisible. "So we made a decision," the voice said. The War Minister didn't speak. He didn't need to, because whatever was coming next, he already knew it mattered. "We chose to look weak." The silence that followed was absolute, because the implication was immediate, deliberate, terrifying. "You hid," the War Minister said slowly. "No," the voice corrected. "We adapted." The display shifted one final time. The battlefield, as it was now. The scattered vessels. The emerging warships. The entire system, alive with motion. "You see a planet," the voice said. The War Minister stared at the screen. At the scale. At the complexity. At the realization forming piece by piece. "We built a response," the voice finished. "Not a fleet. Not a defense. A response." The War Minister felt it then, not fear, not fully, but the edge of it. The understanding that what he had believed to be a disorganized resistance was something else entirely. Something intentional. Something patient. "Sir," the sensor officer said, his voice low, "the new vessels are accelerating." The War Minister didn't look away from the display. "Of course they are," he said quietly. Because now he understood. The first phase hadn't been the battle. It had been the invitation. And this was what answered. Across the void, the massive human warships surged forward. And for the first time since the invasion began, the War Minister realized something that had never once occurred to him before entering this system. They hadn't been caught unprepared. They had been waiting. And the worst part, they hadn't even started yet. The order to unleash full firepower came without hesitation. "All divisions, maximum output," the War Minister commanded, his voice steady, but stripped now of any illusion that this would be quick. "No restraint. No containment. End this." Across the fleet, energy surged to levels that strained even their own systems. Weapon arrays flared to life in synchronized intensity, releasing volleys that turned the darkness between the stars into a burning lattice of destructive force. This was no longer a demonstration. This was eradication doctrine: overwhelm, obliterate, erase. The human response was immediate. And completely wrong. Instead of forming defensive lines, instead of bracing for impact or attempting to counter with equal force, the human vessels scattered again, but this time not outward. They moved through the fire. Not avoiding it entirely, not escaping its reach, but threading between it in ways that defied every predictive model. Ships angled into trajectories that should have guaranteed destruction, only to veer at the last possible instant, slipping through gaps that hadn't existed until they forced them into existence. "They are not evading," the tactical officer said, her voice tight with disbelief. "They are using our fire." On the display, the effect became horrifyingly clear. The fleet's own volleys, precise, calculated, devastating, were being redirected by human movement patterns. Ships darted between converging beams, forcing targeting systems to adjust mid-fire, causing trajectories to overlap in ways that redirected energy into unintended vectors. Into their own formation. "Adjust targeting protocols," the War Minister snapped. "We are trying," the officer replied. "They are forcing continuous recalibration. We cannot stabilize firing solutions." A warship on the left flank shuddered violently as a redirected beam tore through its shields from an impossible angle. Another lost propulsion entirely as cascading energy feedback overloaded its systems. "They are turning our structure against us," the communications officer said quietly. The War Minister didn't respond. Because he could see it. Every strength his fleet relied on, precision, coordination, predictability, was being inverted. Not countered. Inverted. "Push forward," he ordered instead. "Close distance. Force engagement at close range." If they could not dominate from range, they would overwhelm through proximity. Their ships were built for it: heavier armor, stronger shields, superior weapon output at minimal distance. The fleet surged inward. And that was when the humans changed again. From the edges of the engagement zone, the larger vessels, the ones that had remained distant until now, began to move. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that made the shift impossible to ignore. "Those are not repositioning," the sensor officer said, his voice dropping. "They are aligning," the tactical officer corrected. "For what?" the War Minister demanded. No one answered. Because the answer arrived before it could be spoken. Across the system, every active human node, every ship, every station, every hidden platform, shifted in subtle synchronization. Not into formation, not into any recognizable structure, but into something far more precise. A network. The massive vessels at the outer edge were not reinforcements. They were anchors. "Energy surge detected," the sensor officer said sharply. "System-wide." The display lit up as power signatures spiked across every human-controlled asset. Civilian networks, industrial systems, orbital platforms, all feeding into the same expanding lattice of energy flow. "They are pooling resources," the communications officer whispered. "No," the War Minister said slowly. He could see the pattern now. "They are routing them." The realization hit all at once. This wasn't a fleet engaging a fleet. This was an entire civilization focusing itself. "Interrupt the network," he ordered immediately. "Target the large vessels. Cut the flow." The fleet redirected fire again, concentrating on the massive human constructs anchoring the system. But the response came faster. Smaller vessels surged forward, not to attack, but to intercept. They placed themselves directly in the path of incoming fire, absorbing impacts that tore through their hulls, breaking apart under the strain. "They are sacrificing themselves," one officer said, stunned. "No," the communications officer replied, her voice hollow. "They are choosing where we hit." Every intercepted shot altered the trajectory of the remaining energy, diffusing it, redirecting it, weakening its impact on the core network. "They are controlling the damage," the tactical officer said. The War Minister felt something cold settle deep in his chest. This wasn't desperation. This was design. "Sir," the sensor officer said again, his voice strained now. "The energy output is reaching critical thresholds." "How critical?" the War Minister asked. The officer hesitated. "Beyond any known civilian capacity," he said. Across the display, the network stabilized. And then it pulsed. A wave of energy surged outward from the anchored vessels, not as a weapon in the traditional sense, but as a field, expanding, layered, intersecting with every human-controlled asset in the system. "What is that?" the War Minister demanded. No one answered immediately, because no one had ever seen it before. The field passed through the battlefield in less than a second. And everything changed. Human vessels moved differently. Faster. Sharper. Not just in speed, but in coordination, each action now aligned with the others in ways that had not been visible before. The decentralized chaos hadn't disappeared. It had evolved. "They've unified," the tactical officer said, her voice barely above a whisper. The War Minister shook his head slowly. "No," he said, because he understood now. They've always been unified. What he had mistaken for independence was something else entirely. Layers of autonomy operating within a shared framework that could shift from loose coordination to precise synchronization in an instant. "They can switch," the communications officer said, the realization hitting her at the same time. "Between chaos and order. On demand," the War Minister finished. The implications were staggering. There was no single strategy to counter. No fixed pattern to exploit. They could be unpredictable when needed, precise when required, and something far worse when both states overlapped. "Sir," the sensor officer said again, panic edging into his voice. "We are losing ships across all sectors." The display confirmed it. Not through overwhelming force, but through accumulation, disruption, breakdown. The fleet was unraveling. "Report losses," the War Minister said, his voice quieter now. "Significant," the officer replied. "And increasing." The word felt insufficient. Across the void, human vessels continued to move, some burning, some damaged, some barely holding together, but none withdrawing, none hesitating. "They are not pulling back," one officer said. "They won't," the communications officer replied. "Why not?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately, because the answer was already visible. On the display. In the movement. In the pattern. "Because this isn't a battle for them," she said finally. The War Minister looked at her, then back at the screen. And for the first time, he understood the difference. This wasn't about victory. This was about something else entirely. Something the galaxy had forgotten. "Sir," the sensor officer said again, his voice shaking now. "New energy spike, outer system, magnitude unknown." The War Minister turned back to the display. Another surge. Bigger. Deeper. Not part of the existing network. Something separate. Something they hadn't accounted for. "What is that?" he demanded. The answer came slowly. Reluctantly. "We don't know," the officer admitted. Across the battlefield, the human vessels shifted again. Subtle, deliberate, creating space, opening paths, adjusting their positions as if making room for something that had not yet arrived. The War Minister stared at the expanding void they were leaving behind. At the silence forming in the middle of chaos. And for the first time since the war began, a thought broke through his control, sharp and undeniable. They were not escalating anymore. They were preparing. For something worse. The silence at the center of the battlefield expanded. It wasn't empty. It was cleared. Human vessels pulled back from that region with deliberate precision, not in retreat, not in disorder, but in controlled absence. Every movement carved out space, every vector aligned to form a void that no human craft entered, no weapon fire crossed, no interference touched. They weren't avoiding it. They were reserving it. "What is forming there?" the War Minister demanded, his voice no longer sharp, but tight, controlled, like something held too long at the edge of fracture. No one answered immediately, because the readings coming in did not match any known category. "Energy concentration rising," the sensor officer said slowly, his hands moving faster across his console than ever before. "It's not directional. It's not contained to a single emitter. It's everywhere inside that region." The War Minister stared at the growing void. Not a weapon signature. Not a fleet formation. A convergence. "Magnitude?" he asked. The officer hesitated. "Undefined." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one we have," the officer replied, his voice tightening. "Our systems cannot model it." Across the bridge, tension thickened into something suffocating. Because everything they had seen so far, every tactic, every maneuver, every adaptation, had followed some form of logic, even if it was alien in its execution. This did not. "This is a trap," one of the senior commanders said quietly. "They want us to commit to that space." The War Minister didn't dismiss it. Because for the first time, instinct aligned with caution. "All units hold position," he ordered. "Do not advance into the central zone." The command spread across the fleet. And for a brief moment, the battle slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. Human vessels continued their operations along the edges, still engaging, still disrupting, still breaking apart any attempt at recovery, but they did not push inward. They did not force the issue. They waited. The War Minister watched them. "They are giving us a choice," he said. No one responded. Because the implication was worse than any direct attack. "They want us to decide," the communications officer said, her voice barely steady. "To step forward or not." "And if we don't?" one officer asked. No one had an answer. Because the question itself felt incomplete. The War Minister clenched his jaw. "Status of command cohesion," he demanded. "Fragmenting," the tactical officer replied immediately. "Multiple divisions are requesting withdrawal authorization. Others are pushing for full assault before that structure completes." "Before what completes?" he pressed. She didn't answer. Because she didn't know. Because no one did. Across the fleet, signals began to spike, not from the humans, but from within their own ranks. Command channels flooded with conflicting directives. Some captains were already pulling back, breaking formation without authorization. Others surged forward, unwilling to concede momentum. "They're losing control," the communications officer said. The War Minister didn't correct her. Because she wasn't wrong. "Not anymore." "Reassert command," he ordered sharply. "All units, hold formation." But even as the order went out, he could see it failing. The fleet was built on structure, on hierarchy, on trust in centralized authority. And that structure was cracking under pressure that no doctrine had prepared them for. "Sir," the sensor officer said again, his voice low now. "The energy concentration, it's stabilizing." The War Minister turned back to the display. The void was no longer expanding. It was condensing. Whatever was forming there had reached a threshold. And now it was holding. "Scan for output," he said. "We are," the officer replied. "There is no emission." "Impossible." "Confirmed." The War Minister stared at the readings. All that power, all that convergence, and no release. "What are they doing?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. The answer came from the communications officer. "They're waiting," she said. "For what?" another officer demanded. She swallowed. "For us." The words settled over the bridge like a final warning. Because now it was clear. This wasn't a trap in the traditional sense. It was something worse. It was an ultimatum without words. Advance, and face whatever had been built in that void. Withdraw, and accept defeat. The War Minister closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Not in hesitation. In calculation. Behind him, voices rose, arguments, demands, fear breaking through discipline. Some commanders were already disengaging, their ships pulling away from the formation, retreating toward the outer system. Others held position, waiting for orders that might never come. "Sir," the tactical officer said urgently, "if we don't act now, we lose initiative completely." "And if we do," the communications officer countered, "we might lose everything." The War Minister opened his eyes and made his choice. "All forward units," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Advance." The bridge froze. "Sir," someone began. "We do not retreat," he said, louder now. "We do not yield to unknown threats. We break them." The command transmitted, and for a moment, it seemed like the fleet might hold together. Warships surged forward, engines flaring as they committed to the advance, pushing toward the silent center where all that energy waited. The void did not react. It did not shift. It did not resist. It simply allowed them to enter. The first ship crossed the threshold. Nothing happened. The second followed. Still nothing. A ripple of relief began to spread across the bridge, fragile but real. "See," one officer said, almost laughing. "It's nothing." The third ship entered. And vanished. Not destroyed. Not shattered. Gone. Every system feed from that vessel cut simultaneously, not with the chaos of damage, but with the finality of absence. "What just happened?" the War Minister demanded. No one answered. Because the fourth ship was already crossing the line. And this time, the void answered. The fourth ship did not vanish. It broke. Not from impact, not from explosion, but from something deeper, its structure unraveling as if the rules that held it together had simply stopped applying. Hull plating peeled away in silent layers, internal systems collapsed inward, and then the entire vessel folded into nothing that sensors could interpret. The bridge fell into absolute stillness. "What is happening?" the War Minister demanded, but the question no longer carried authority. It carried disbelief. "Field interaction confirmed," the sensor officer said, his voice hollow. "It's not a weapon in the conventional sense. It's a boundary condition." "Explain." "We can't," he admitted. "Inside that zone, our systems cease to function as defined. Matter stability is compromised." The words felt inadequate for what they were witnessing. The void wasn't destroying ships. It was rejecting them. "Pull back," one of the senior commanders said, his composure finally breaking. "All units, disengage." "Negative," the War Minister snapped, but even he could hear the fracture in his own voice. Because more ships were entering. Not by his command. By momentum. The forward elements of the fleet had committed too deeply, their acceleration carrying them across the threshold before counterorders could reach them. One after another, they crossed into the void. And one after another, they ceased to exist in any way that mattered. "Stop them!" the communications officer shouted. "Override propulsion." "We can't," the tactical officer replied. "Control latency, signal disruption." The words blurred into noise as the display filled with disappearing markers, each loss more final than the last. "They're not being destroyed," the sensor officer said again, almost as if trying to convince himself. "They're being removed." The War Minister stared at the screen, his mind racing, searching for something, anything, that resembled a counter. There wasn't one. Because this wasn't a battle anymore. It was a limit. "Cease advance," he said finally, his voice low. This time, the order spread. Ships veered off, engines straining as they fought to break away from trajectories that had once seemed inevitable. The formation dissolved, not strategically, not cleanly, but in raw survival. Retreat. The word didn't need to be spoken. It was already happening. Across the void, human vessels did not pursue. They didn't press the advantage. They didn't collapse the remaining fleet. They held position. Watching. Allowing. "Why aren't they finishing us?" one officer whispered. The War Minister didn't answer. Because he understood now. This wasn't about annihilation. It never had been. A transmission came through. Clear. Uninterrupted. "This is Earth," the voice said. The same voice. The same calm. But now, it carried something else. Finality. You crossed the line, it continued. You saw what happens when you do. The War Minister stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. What is that? He demanded. What did you build? There was a pause. Not for effect. For precision. We didn't build it, the voice replied. The War Minister's breath caught. We defined it. The words settled into place, reshaping everything that had come before. You think in terms of weapons, the voice continued. Things that act on targets. Things that can be measured, countered, overcome. The display shifted, not by their systems, but by the incoming signal. The void. The boundary. The absence that wasn't empty. We think in terms of conditions, the voice said. Environments. States that either allow you to exist, or don't. The War Minister felt it then. The scale of it. Not a weapon to fire. Not a fleet to deploy. A rule. You turned space itself against us, he said quietly. No, the voice corrected. We made sure that space, under certain conditions, doesn't tolerate you. Silence followed. Not just on the bridge. Everywhere. Because the implication was absolute. There was no countermeasure for a condition. No defense against a rule. You could have used it on all of us, the War Minister said. Yes. The single word hit harder than anything else. Why didn't you? Another officer asked, his voice barely steady. The answer came without hesitation. Because you can still leave. The War Minister closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the battlefield had already changed. What remained of his fleet, fractured, damaged, incomplete, was pulling away from the system. No pursuit. No interference. Just distance growing between them and the world they had tried to claim. How many did we lose? He asked quietly. No one answered. Because the number no longer mattered. What mattered was what remained. And what didn't. You were warned, the voice said, softer now. Not by us. The War Minister thought of the chamber. The silence. The evacuations. The fear he had dismissed. You knew, he said. They all did, the voice replied. They just hoped you would listen. The transmission began to fade. One more thing, the voice added. The War Minister looked up. Do not come back, it said. Not a threat. Not a demand. A statement. The signal cut. Silence filled the bridge once more, but it was different now. Heavier. Permanent. Through the fractured viewport, Earth hung in the distance, a blue sphere, calm, unchanged, almost peaceful in the way it reflected its star. It didn't look like a battlefield. It didn't look like a fortress. It didn't look like anything that could have done what it just had. And that was the point. Set course away from the system, the War Minister said finally. No one questioned it. As the fleet turned, as distance grew, as the void receded into something that no longer touched them, the War Minister allowed himself one last look. Not at the boundary. At the planet. At the world that had chosen to appear weak. That had chosen to wait. That had drawn a line so absolute it didn't need to be defended twice. The galaxy would hear about this. It would spread, reshaped, retold, misunderstood in 1,000 ways. But the truth would remain the same. Humanity had not proven it was the strongest. It had proven something far worse. That when it decided where the line was, nothing else got to exist on the other side of it.